thank you both for joining us. For our viewing audience, this is an ADEC in conversation on racial injustice, loss, and grief in the Black community. Now, we've been doing the ADEC in conversation series on COVID. It has been moderated by Jill Harrington. And this is another really relevant issue for ADEC and our membership. And so we wanted to continue our public outreach by offering these conversations as well. Now, because this is part of our public outreach and there will be people outside of our ADEC family who are watching them, I would really appreciate it if our two researchers would introduce themselves with the understanding that you can have 100 people who research in the same basic area, but their individual work and specialization is going to be as unique as fingerprints. And so each of you has something very unique to contribute to the conversation. So, Tashelle, would you like to introduce yourself first? I'm just looking around.
Sure. So, hi, I'm Tashelle Bourdaire. I'm a researcher and faculty member at the University of Missouri in Columbia. My area of specialization is youth adjustment to loss with focus on Black youth and family bereavement. And looking at those issues from a social justice perspective in terms of them getting the types of supports that they need to be able to function amid a number of different losses.
And Tashelle, you've also been a pioneer within ADEC in many different domains, serving as editor on the forum for a long time, numerous presentations and workshops, and an amazing repertoire of publications.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be here. I'm Jennifer Matthews, newly associate professor
Congratulations!
Thank you, at Oakland University in Michigan. And there I do research on multicultural counseling and grief and loss and counselor education and supervision. I'm a licensed professional counselor and have a private practice where I work with the bereaved, and I'm currently serving on the board for ADEC.
Thank you so much. And
Yes.
also, you've been instrumental working with our students and youth professionals.
Yes.
That's been great. They're an awesome group of individuals.
Well, and it's an important part of ADEC and helping us grow as an organization and get new people in and included. For those of our members who are, or viewing audience, I should say, who are outside of ADEC, I'm Rebecca Morris. I'm the current president for ADEC, and my background is actually in developmental psychology and gynecology. So I'd already mentioned the title of this, but one of the things that on the board of directors and the executive committee of ADEC is recognizing that this is nothing new, despite the fact that we're now seeing a lot more in the media in terms of African American perspectives, grief and loss in general, grief and loss in the Black community. This isn't new, but the attention that we're seeing is new. And so one of the things we're doing in this sort of series of conversations is this is the first one in the series and sort of setting this stage, sort of an overview. And so I would like to open the floor up for either one of you to sort of jump in and just sort of share sort of what your role is and what you see as some of the roles for people in academia, clinicians, researchers.
I can start off. So I am a counselor educator, meaning I work in a counseling department. We prepare graduate students to be counselors, mental health counselors, school counselors. And so from my role as a counselor educator, a lot of it is by focusing on the teaching aspect. It's the curriculum that we are providing. What are we talking about? How we're connecting it to people and their lived experiences. And so trying to be very intentional about bringing contemporary, current issues that are going on in society into the classroom so that we can discuss it in a meaningful way. And so that could be using current events. So talking to students about George Floyd's murder, talking about the implications of that, society in society, but also from if you're working with a client and they've experienced vicarious trauma because they looked at the video, or they're trying to explain to their child what happened, or if your client is a child and they're grappling with what that was like and just trying to make sense out of what doesn't make sense. And so my role, as far as teaching goes, would be and is to integrate all of these contemporary issues into the curriculum, whether I'm teaching a diversity class, whether I'm teaching a grief and loss class, or teaching the clinical skills class, which is a basic course on attending behaviors, but making sure that I'm being intentional about that.
And to kind of, I guess, highlight that based just as Jennifer mentioned, as I in the courses that I teach, sometimes people say, well, let's do diversity and issues, contextual issues going on in our culture really cross. They fit into any course that I teach. Even a developmental course when that I was teaching, a lifespan development course, when shootings were going on. This was prior to George Floyd. Even I kind of had them look up like stats on the number of deaths that occur. I try to use those as kind of teachable moments that don't feel intimidating, but that really address what's going on and why are we missing certain types of data and information with regard to police shootings and things of that nature. And also saying we're going to be talking about a lot of that kind of stuff today. And I think I want to highlight that we're in no way implying that every person who is a police officer or lawyer or judge or any of those people are, have ill intentions. But what we're going to be talking about today are patterns that we see that have just been reoccurring historically and that we still see in contemporary society. And I think that's important for our listeners to know, to the aspiring students, clinicians, future therapists, researchers, that is always important. It's not these aren't bad words or anything like that, but we do have to address patterns if we want things to shift. So we are going to talk about patterns today, like we mentioned that we do in our courses. A lot of my work is built around, in terms of research and any consultations or programming that I develop, is really built around oftentimes fostering understanding and education among adult populations who will be working with youth, right? Who whether they serve Black bereaved youth and families, and if they're not serving those populations, then we're trying to figure out why you aren't and how we might help you get into those spaces because it's necessary. So either you're doing it or there's a big deficit and that this is really what you want to do. You really know how important it is to reach out to Black communities and get their needs met, but you need some help with that. And so that's where I bridge gaps, and then also the piece where I give voice to teenagers about their experiences and young adults, college students, through my research, largely focused on homicide loss and more disenfranchising type of deaths. I'm glad we're having this conversation today because I was going to say that there are a lot of just cumulative losses that people experience. I'm excited to be here with Dr. Matthews because, and as well as you, Dr. Morse, because you both, work directly with, again, people who are either serving different populations or trying to deal with them professionally. And I'm just intrigued by both of you and your work too, as you do additional work outside of the classroom too with this. So I'm looking forward to us talking about those types of things today.
What you said, Tashelle, strikes me because the creating space, and that's huge with working with graduate students because everyone is coming from a different background.
Mm-hmm.
And normally I start off the conversation of, these are going to be difficult conversations that many feelings will be invoked. You might feel guilty, you might feel angry, you may feel ashamed, and that this is all part of the process. And so creating that space where students feel comfortable and then diving into, what it's like for them. And in part of my role as a facilitator and educator is calling out some of the dynamics that I'm seeing. So, if I'm seeing microaggressions, bringing that to their attention in a very teachable manner so that it can be received and that students can think and reflect on their behaviors, their thoughts, and their feelings.
And I think it's really important you mentioned the microaggressions because I think one of the things that can be uncomfortable, and I've seen this in my own classroom dynamics, is that nobody wakes up thinking they're a bad person.
Right.
And so when someone says, oh, that was a microaggression, it's hard when that may not have been your intent to
Mm-hmm.
not feel defensive, but to recognize the whole nature of a microaggression is actually, it's about how it's received.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's still work to be done there to bridge that intent versus receipt in
Mm-hmm.
order to sort of create that rapport, that feeling. I've seen that happen a number of times in my classroom. And when people have those authentic conversations and they stop othering one
Mm-hmm.
another, it's beautiful to see that relationship build.
Yes.
It
Yes.
is. Mhm.
Yeah. And so as I think about our discussion today of Black families and grief, um, and people, and also, can we clarify for people who might not know, be clear about what microaggressions are?
Thank you.
Somebody, one of you can mention it, or I'm glad to.
Sure, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Microaggressions are basically, and this concept has been around for a while. It's just been, now it's called microaggressions, but it's kind of like this um, kind of passive aggressive way or passive approach to still saying something that is saying something that is stereotypical, uh, or or passively engaging in some type of discrimination or some type of behavior that is based on a person's character, based on a misjudgment, misperception of a person's. I don't. I guess I want to say based on some type of misconceptualization of a person. So I'm to the point now where I take pictures of people when I go into stores who, particularly bookstores, because I do that a lot, who follow me around, actually everywhere. I won't even say just books. So let's just be real. A lot of places that I go into, people all of a sudden want to fix the clothes in the area where I'm standing, or they want to readjust the books on the bookshelf right next to where I am, although the place is empty and those books are perfectly aligned. So they would never think that, they would never say that they were being prejudiced by coming to do that, but they really are trying to say, I want to make sure you're not stealing. So instead of just saying blatantly, I want to make sure you're not stealing, they just come and try to adjust the books. But the impact is still the same, because I know that they are standing there with the misconception that I'm going to be taking a book off the shelf, or I don't know, putting the shirt in my purse, or I don't know. So it's these passive aggressive behaviors that are still communicating a lack of trust, and they're based on some conscious or unconscious thoughts about the person that they're interacting with.
And I think that's something that's really important as well for all of us to remember is that we're not talking about statistics or opinions. We're talking about
Yeah.
a human being's lived experience.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what statistics I rattle off or talking about the percentages of this or that. That doesn't change your lived experience or my lived experience. And other people don't get opinions on that lived experience.
Right.
It's yours, it's personal. And that's something that I know I try to reinforce with my clinical students is sort of recognizing what are those boundaries for where you're comfortable, but also recognizing that to truly be authentic and have empathy for someone else, you're going to have to lean into your comfort to understand or try to understand. Not their experience, because you can't, but to understand it's different from your own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, when we are considering this topic of racial injustice, I thought about it in terms of death losses and non-death
Mm-hmm.
losses. And um, I think, Tashelle, you're going to talk about the cumulative grief related to death losses, but even in the non-death losses, the loss of a sense of belonging
Mm-hmm.
that Black individuals, African Americans experience, the lack of trust, the lack of, security, that these are common um, experiences that everyone should have, that they should feel secure, they should feel accepted, that they shouldn't feel hyper vigilant. But these are non death losses that on a daily basis African Americans may experience because of racial inequities and systems of racism within our country.
Yeah. And with that, let's go into it. Let's get into it then,
I
Jennifer,
would,
because you're right there. It's hard to not, right? It's like you can't really
Mhm.
have this conversation without looking at the cumulative losses that, and I would say people of color deal with. And and then more specifically, when we talk about black populations, black populations are, disproportionately impacted by healthcare disparities, as we're seeing with COVID and a greater vulnerability to death and the death disparities. Um, we are seeing it with community violence, right, as well as violence at the hands of people who are supposed to be designed to protect black children, black teens, and families. And then when you look at each one of those, right, and you can't, what's interesting is that, when I've done interviews or when I do research on homicide loss, it's never just that, you know, like the people I'm talking to, the college students, the teenagers tied into that um, are also like health related deaths of a grandparent due to diabetes, right? Which is a preventable condition, or some other type of loss, and then also the loss of support when they get back to school. So all of their experiences intertwined, inextricably intertwined, in their homicide loss experience is the experience of other deaths that impact black families to an even larger extent, right? These preventable deaths and chronic illnesses, in addition to the non-death losses of being followed around when they go into places. Um, and then going back to school settings where teachers are also drained, right? And I think teachers are incredible people, but they're also taxed, and sometimes their own trauma around loss, or their just lack of education around loss, and what that looks like leads to lack of support in places where they could have been supportive, or even punishment, right? Uh, Punishment that might come through misunderstanding the behaviors of people who've been impacted by trauma and loss, and multiple sources, right? And then one more to not make us want to just be completely depressed right now, or just the other deaths that we see on TV, right? Like, I mean, everywhere you look, there is some huge sense of loss, and then there's the historical stuff, right? That your grandparents went through, and the stories they've told, right? That we used to function, you know, but that overall Kobe Bryant died, right? And that caused collective grief. You don't even know Kobe, but he died. So it's like, oh my goodness, like there's death and loss all around black communities, and it's amazing that black youth and families are functioning, and so that's a strength, the ability to just maneuver through that, through those numerous losses. But to think about how complex that is, and unpacking that in different spaces, how important that is to further so that black families and youth can continue to function and move about in this world, right? So you can never look at a person without looking at the context and the numerous experiences, right, that they are encountering and how complex it is, but it's doable. So I also want to say this too.
Yeah.
It's not so. Some people don't do things because I also do work on cultural responsive practice because they think, oh, I don't know the black experience. Is a lot that they're dealing with. Yes, but and we'll talk about this more probably in the future when there are a lot of strategies that can be used. I don't want to leave from the loss experience versus I do think we want to. It's important to contextualize that a little bit further and how that looks when you work with a black person, right, who's dealing with these different types of losses. But I do want to say, I don't know. I'll stop. I'll pause there. But
No,
cumulative, yeah,
yeah, what you said, I mean, the bereavement overload, we were
yes,
using that term, the cumulative grief, um, and kind of realizing, for example, I worked with a client that had their father died, and he died in a part of town that was predominantly white. It was rural in Michigan, but white and rural. And so prior to him going to where his father was, it was in the middle of the night. And so instead of just, throwing on whatever, this client told me in passing, well, I had to put on some nice pants. I had to put on a button down shirt. And this was 2 o'clock in the morning. And so if I wasn't aware of the context of this client, it's a Black male client, um, and the importance that he took in how he was dressing, I would have missed a wealth of information. And so we were able to pause and to stop. And I said, what was it like for you to have to reflect on what you were going to wear to see your dying father? And the reason why I was doing that was because he didn't want to get stopped by the police. And if he did, he wanted to look a certain way because it was 2 a.m. and he wanted to reduce the number of questions or suspicions. And so I think, part of, for me, having this conversation is not just validating that this is important, but affirming that, bereavement overload, cumulative grief within the African American community is expansive, and it's about, these death losses that Tashelle, you mentioned, historically, contemporarily, but then also these non-death losses of, like, the talk that
yeah,
kids have, and that's a loss of innocence to have to talk to a child about how to interface with the police. That now it's, you know the innocence of a child is no longer, you're talking to them as you would an adult, an older teenager, but you're having this conversation with a 5, 6 year older.
yeah.
um, but it's unfortunately necessary within the society we live in.
Well, a couple of things that I think that we're really key to emphasize for some of our viewers. One of the things we know is a risk factor for complicated, prolonged, chronic, traumatic grief. Pick the term for,
Yeah.
right, we have a lot of different theories and approaches to it. But underscoring things that can make grief especially painful is when we knew the death or we know the death was preventable. And I think that is one of the things that is so crucial about what we're seeing with some of these deaths that have recently been highlighted, is the fact that there is anger because it was preventable. And
Yeah.
feeling so, I don't even have the right adjective, but when you feel powerless and even potentially hopeless to prevent it from happening again, it is a
Yeah.
human response to get angry. And you get angry often because you're scared. And when the person who died is a reflection of us in some way, we identify with them in some way, it becomes more personal.
Yes.
Because you absolutely empathize with their experience because you feel like they're a reflection of you.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we do that all the time, right? When we watch TV and there's a couple on the show that bickers like we do with our partner spouse,
Hmm. Hmm.
immediately put ourselves in those characters.
Yeah.
Yep.
Someone dies or is hurt to resemble us. That hurts us.
Yeah.
And we see
Yeah.
that, and I think that's one of the factors when we talk about things like intergenerational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Is when you've grown up seeing things, hearing the story, even if you're not close to them, it's still a vicarious trauma.
Yeah.
And it's part of your experience with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's an internalization.
Yeah.
It could
Oh,
be internalizing oppression, so and this kind of takes us in another direction, but you cannot not be affected
Right.
by hearing, the trauma
Yeah.
over centuries.
Yeah. And one thing that I was going to say, and I love that example that you gave about um, just how it's an ordinary experience. It's so ordinary that he described it, but like the client who you saw described his experience, and that you gave him some space to just pause and take that in, right? Because that's another part of the grief response of black families and people of color and any oppressed group is often, well, especially among black families, and particularly among women, is just this notion of pushing forward, going on. Because if you paused every time something happens, you would never leave your house, right? And right now we can't, so we're really stuck with all of this stuff, both black people and allies, and other people who are trying to make sense of this. So it's healing to when a therapist or a researcher is really listening, right? The best gift we can give is a listening ear. We can hear and give people space to say, wait a minute, you had to get, your dad died or you had to spend some time doing that first. So that's a loss of time, loss of energy to go searching, when physical energy, emotional energy, like so many types of, and then also the energy of the hyper vigilance that he had to maintain for that whole drive, when he should have been able to just focus on getting to his father. So it's like
Exactly.
those losses during the course of a day, preparing to enter a meeting where if you say something, you're going to be considered an angry black woman, or it's just all day long you are hoping these things don't happen, but you know that there's a propensity for them to occur, and that there's intersectionality too, right? So black women and black men, there's some commonality in our experiences, and then there are some things that are unique about our experiences in the world, right? And so so there are a lot of complexities, and so we're talking about race, but also want to say we're never separate from, you know, it's never to be separated from gender as well, or sex, or any other type of. Those are the two primary, at least two of the primary features that people notice first, right? Because they're the most visible.
They're the physical. Yeah.
Yes, and then one other thing I wanted to highlight about parental socialization has always been a protective factor in black families for children, right? Like black parents have always have been preparing their children. It's a part of normal socialization in black families. There's no choice about racial socialization, and no choice about having your children feel, do things to help them feel confident in a world that might dehumanize them in many spaces, right? That won't see them as human, to humanize their reactions or their feelings about different things. But we know that, geez, I was see this, and there's a lot too, right? So again, I'm a black person and a scholar and a female, and we're talking about this, and I'm in my own moment and feeling about this, right? As we talk, so please bear with me in this. But this is what I was going to say with regard to parenting. Joining in on what Jennifer mentioned a few moments ago, is that the strategies that black parents have been using, and grandparents and church families and communities have been using to help keep kids safe or safer, right? Or more safe, are not working. And that is also a loss for parents in terms of their parenting approach. So, for example, you know, when you're socialized to know, black parents haven't just started saying how to be safe in a car, right?
Yeah.
The kids have observed their parents be nervous for years, so whether they talked about it or not, kids have known, oh, sit straight up, don't eat that French fry right now. I mean, this stress of just trying to go to an amusement park, you already knew you should be engaging in a certain behavior because there's any slight chance we could get pulled over. We don't want that to happen. So parents have already been trying to do this. Kids get ready to get a driver's license, and this is another conversation. It's ongoing. Don't say anything back. Hands on the steering wheel. Like all of these crazy, these things that parents have been socializing their kids to do. Those aren't even working now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's also a
Yeah.
loss of strategy now. That's
Yeah.
even perplexing and is producing even more grief for black parents who go into work and who are trying to navigate their lives but have constant worry about the safety of their kids in all of these spaces that are supposed to be safe in the school, right? At school that day, right? Where they and will their reaction to something be perceived misperceived, or negative, get punished, right? And then in the car, like, I know I told you to put your hands on the thing, but let's see what else we can do. Let's see, put your hands on the steering wheel, maybe look with your left eye, but don't with your right. I mean, it's like we're running out of possibilities about how to stay safe, and that also, to go but along what you were mentioning, Rebecca, is overwhelming and further
Mm-hmm.
complicates even anticipatory grief. Let's not even get
Yeah.
to the grief of a death, but like anticipatory grief of like, wow, this isn't even keeping my kids safe now. So, geez, I'm at work now, distracted, and that's impacting productivity, right? You can't be present the same, and that is not. I bring that up because that is not the experience of some other groups. Not to say other parents don't have worries, but I want everybody who's listening to think about going into work and just having that on your mind while you're trying to do these other things and do your job, that you are worried about, your third grader being, taken out of math or science because they actually raised their hand, but you thought they raised it too harshly, or so, or when they leave school, like, will they make it home safely? Your teenager who's driving. So it's just these daily worries in addition to the loss, right? You got the losses, and then you got the worries about a potential loss. So it is a lot, and so
And they're race
that's
specific. They're
yes,
race specific. That's
yes,
the other piece is that they're
yes,
they're specific to people of color.
yes,
And I think that that is absolutely imperative to recognize, because any parent's going to say, well, I worry about my kid.
yeah,
This is adding another level. And when those coping mechanisms that the parents have relied on, behave like this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and you minimize risk.
yeah,
And the closest correlation right now would be for parents who are worried about COVID, right?
yeah.
He comes out with recommendations: wash your hands 20 seconds, wear a mask, do this, stay 6 feet apart, and you won't get COVID. But then someone they know did all of that and they still got COVID.
Yes, perfect example. Good
So
analogy.
that mechanism to keep your family safe isn't foolproof. And so what we're hearing and seeing now is these coping mechanisms aren't working the way they were expected.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Right.
and
Which
that's his own
leads
source of
to
grief.
those feelings of hopelessness that you mentioned, Rebecca. Um, Anger, apathy, um, just a myriad of feelings
Hmm.
that people experience.
Well, and I think, and I don't know where I heard this or picked this up, so I'm not trying to not give credit where it's due. But the idea that a hopeless man fears nothing, meaning there's no, if you are without hope and apathy, you're apathetic about things, you don't fear consequences.
Right.
You're more likely to behave in a manner separate from considering consequences because of that hopelessness, because of that. And I just wish that there were a way to really drive that empathy to understand that behaviors don't occur in a vacuum,
Right.
right? They come from a combination of internal factors and external factors. And that's where I think looking at the issues unique to grief in the Black community are so important for ADEC to consider as we're working with our patients, our clients, students, and reaching them where they are. Because as professionals, that's our job, right? It's to reach people where they are. And for me, at least, that's part of why ADEC needed to have a voice in this conversation, because we need to meet people where they are. And I know that that was a key thing that I heard from both of you in our conversation about why you're helping to educate our members, but also the larger community.
Yeah.
So what would be something that, as thanatologists, that you would encourage or recommend for them to help them be more mindful and empathetic when they're working with their population, whether it's clients, patients, students, etc.? That's a big question.
I'm ready
Yeah.
for it. You want to go,
Go right
Jen?
ahead. Go right ahead.
I don't mind if you want to go. What,
Um,
or,
well, one of the things that first comes to mind, and I focus a lot on with graduate students, is being aware of yourself, starting with
hmm
yourself first. Um, so what that means is being reflective. Um, and sometimes it's hard to be reflective when we all have blind spots, and so we're not it's hard to know what the blind spots are if we have the blind spots. And so there's this whole idea of self-education. There's a lot of materials that are out now, especially now, regarding being an anti-racist, raising your self-awareness, raising your consciousness. But um, and I say take in that information. Also look at yourself. Look at some of the areas of discomfort. We've talked about sitting in discomfort, not rejecting those feelings of anger or frustration, but really leaning into it and um, expecting yourself to do the work instead of relying on other people to educate you, but you taking the initiative. And that's for everyone. Everyone has areas of blind spots and areas of growth. Um, we'll get to this, but I also wanted to talk about ADEC's role. And since, those that are watching, some are members, some are non-members, that ADEC, provides these types of programming to increase awareness. The conference presentations. There's, areas of growth also within the organization, and there's a reflective piece there. But on an individual level, just really trying to lean into this discomfort and not minimize that within yourself and not minimizing it within other people.
yeah. And I would add to that. Great points, great ideas and suggestions. This notion of, I guess I want to really emphasize the notion. Oftentimes, when we want to work with populations, we're trying to read about those groups, and of course, you want to read about Black bereavement. I mean, of course, you want to participate in ongoing professional development, such as a participation that ADEC has put on right now, right? Participation in a webinar such as this. But a lot of even tests, right? Even when you get a new job, they're going to be asking you about everybody else with very little focus. We know that there's very little focus in most diversity trainings on just self-awareness and goals that we have, and then celebration of achievements that we have reached, from the smallest to the bigger ones, in terms of how things have shifted for us. So self-awareness really is key to diversity, right? A concept that I came up with is culturally conscientious practice, and that's the notion that we work effectively with populations when we're open to evolving knowledge, right? So my area is African American bereavement, but I'm still learning about, I don't know everything about black teenagers, right? I know some things, but by the time I've learned one, you know, emoji or something, I like need to change that up. It's like they're not using that for that anymore. It's a different type of thing, right? So being open to having some concept, but listening, I can't impart that enough, right? That's the best gift we give to any bereaved person is our human presence, so that we're not missing something because we needed to be able to demonstrate how much we know about something, right? Like listening is always the best gift. So self-awareness, listening, understanding that you don't have to know everything about every group. Like it's going to evolve, right? If you're listening. Another thing is, um, uh, so, and I apologize again. It's like overwhelming. Is knowing that I don't know. I have to pause. I was going to say listening, reflecting, um, and then making sure you're getting to know people who are different from you, right, and similar to you. And if you have these feelings of discomfort, knowing that, um, go find some spaces and places to process that, to think about it, right? Because your feelings do matter, and your discomfort. You might find that you know another person who is an ally who is also uncomfortable, and how can you work through that discomfort, like, but not having that other person, the minority person, do that work for you, right? So finding some space, because there needs to be space for people who feel some sense of guilt, or who feel some sense of stress, like your own. There's grief around understanding privilege or power or systems of oppression, right? I'll give an example. One of my friends who wears, I'll never forget this, right? One of my friends who wears hearing aids, she came to, this was in grad school. She came to the office one day with glasses on, and I was like, Jen, whoa, you look at you, how spiffy and intelligent you look with those glasses on. And she was like, you never said that about my hearing aids, right? So, some things we see as deficits, and other things we culturally see as, and that stuck with me forever, right? And she's okay with me saying her name, I'm sure. But it was like a lesson in cultural responsiveness, and it stuck with me, right? And so I really think a lot of things are analogous to it. I learned from that. I'm more aware of it now, and how I was participating in a system that's oppressive to people who wear hearing aids. So it's like there are so many things to be aware of, and it's not a bad thing. Like I'm smarter now. Take it on as you're even smarter now. We don't have to know everything. I think, again, we're all socialized to know. At school, you need to know. Our creativity is like snatched from us by like third grade. Nobody's wanting to know your family picture of stick people anymore, right? So it's like, how do you go back to your own? How do you say, no, I get to be a critical thinker? It's like you have to own that. That's self-awareness. You have to decide. I get to know more than I've had before. I'm actually going to feel freer. Feel free if I get information. There's a freedom in that. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to highlight. There are strengths in allyship, and don't feel don't let a greater knowledge about privilege or any system you've been participating in be you know be an impediment to doing more and better, because we do better when we use our allyship, when we use our voices for people who they're not hearing yet, that we just turn those voices up. That's a strength. You're using it for good, right?
Yeah. Well, and you made me think about something else, that in one of the classes that I teach, we talk about understanding that we all are cultural beings. And I think if we come from a place where we recognize our own individual culture, then we can really, really be empathic with people in their own culture. Likewise, for licensed professional counselors and other helping professions, the whole idea of cultural competence, we look at the multifaceted role that privilege and oppression plays in every person, that we all have some aspect of privilege in our intersecting identities, and we also experience oppression. And so acknowledging that, along with the self-awareness, the educating yourself of other people, and those culturally competent practices. And then we can't forget social justice and advocacy.
Oh, yeah.
Including that, and being intentional about how we're advocating with someone and on behalf of someone.
Yes. And this people, and also I want to say to that, sometimes people again are afraid of the word social justice, thinking you have to
Hmm.
go do something, explosive or whatever. And I've talked about this too. Social justice comes in the quiet moments. Actually, for most people, it's those simple gestures where we just demonstrate, I see you. I hear you. I think for me, as a longtime member of ADEC and have been active and participating in many different ways, I think it really speaks highly of ADEC's leadership right now, to be able to, and there was so much going on to sift through, right? There's COVID, there's these intersecting things, right? As if, right, being just more visible right now, and how to sort through all of that. Um, and so, but I think it's important that we have like a president of an organization modeling, um, being present, valuing it. These aren't political issues. These are issues about like the lived experiences of human beings, right? And so I know that some organizations are slow to move or won't move on it, or want the side pocket consultation. I do, I do that sometimes, but it's like no, but what? These aren't hard. You will be better able to serve populations if you get these tools. So I appreciate that we have a board member, we have, the president, Dr. Morris, Dr. Matthews, um, uh, and I was a past board member, but like we have a person who is also an ally. Like I will say, I don't, I'm black. I self-identify as black. I don't know how you self-identify, Rebecca, Dr. Morris.
If somebody asked me how I identify, the first word I would say is researcher, believe it or not.
Oh yeah, and I know, and I also want to say that becomes a privilege,
I
right?
get it.
Because
Yeah.
yeah, and I agree, and
And
that's
I am a white chick. I am a
yeah, yes, and that is okay, right? And that is actually that is what we see though most, and so
Hmm.
um, by being an ally, it demonstrates that I'm a white chick. I'm also a researcher and president of an organization, and I validate that this is important. I see you, right? Because we know there are members in organizations who believe that this is important. And when anybody, I could fight for this, I could hope for this all day. But when a person who is in a leadership role, who is important, who is a different voice in the system, gives voice to these experiences, I think it says a lot. So I also want to just commend ADEC, and you as a leader who could have just turned a blind eye to this, for stepping up, making sure that this educational opportunity is provided for our developing scholars, for our longtime scholars, and researchers and clinicians that I personally, on a human level, feel like you see this experience, and you're acknowledging that it's occurring, and you're trying to help us make sure that we have the tools to all function uh, in a positive manner, and using, working from evidence-based practices in our actual work with bereaved populations. We're all here because we want to help. Nobody would just go study death for the heck of it, for the fun of it.
I really appreciate that. I mean, for me, and I know that this, and Jennifer, you can help because you're on the board. I think there's an awareness that we have these terms that are so politically charged, and it's not about the politics. It's
Right.
about human.
Yeah.
It's about the human being in front of us, the connection there, and going beyond. I was incredibly blessed. My first academic advisor in psychology was Dr. Wanda Ruffin at Hope College.
Ah.
Who taught
Whoa.
African American perspectives in thanatology.
Ah.
I got to learn from her and share finding the documentary about Strange Fruit that was recorded by Billie Holiday.
Hmm.
Ah.
And
Yeah.
so that mentorship and learning from her, it's not enough just to be culturally competent. That just
Right.
means you have had knowledge.
Right.
And there hasn't been a lot of publication on it yet, but Lori Easton has a term she calls a difference anxiety.
Hmm.
And it's recognizing that any one of us, when we're sitting with someone who's different from ourselves in any capacity, there's going to be a little bit of anxiety and tension. because there's something about us that temporarily isn't feeling validated because that person's just
Mm, mhm.
and learning how to function within that difference anxiety so it
Yeah.
becomes a bridge to connection, not a barrier.
Hmm.
Not running away, but running towards, really
Yes.
trying to challenge that anxiety.
Yeah. And then taking that step, I can't promote the social justice piece enough. And then seeing what can I do? What can I do? Because we can right. Listen, y'all know death is so empowering. Loss is not empowering, disempowering. Right? COVID right now is so disempowering on so many levels, literally and figuratively. Right? Like as we know, we're like doing this recording, for example, in these various places of our homes. So it's like, what can I do? Because I have even more power as an ally. Like I have like what are the things, and I encourage, I won't say challenge because everything is, can we just do this as a friendly endeavor? I encourage people who are listening to one share this link with other people, right? So that they also have a chance to get even this is just like a snapshot, you all. We
Yeah.
will see more of this, and actually we're hopeful that there will be one to more specifically that addresses culturally responsive practice, culturally conscientious practices in working with black populations. And so we're hoping for that. But in the meantime, right, so we'll share this. And also that you think about what's the one thing that you're going to do, right? Whether it's the increase in self-awareness, reading, one of our works or the works of somebody else. I know that some people say, well, I'm not watching the news, and while we discourage repeated exposure, I also want to highlight that that's a luxury to decide you're not going to decide to not watch the news, right? So I can tell you in terms of black bereavement, I don't have a choice. Like I have to know some things about the news to anticipate and prepare my family and my children, right? And also to screen some things from my children. So it's like you don't have to get deeply embedded, but it is important to know what's going on in the world, and how groups are differentially impacted, so you can be more conversant and knowing that that's a luxury to decide. Oh, for 3 months I'm just going to unplug. Well, I can't ever unplug from this life, and so plugging for a minute is not a bad thing. While we discourage repeated exposure, knowing what's going on is important, and because it's not just again some political thing. It's like, no, that person like really did die. Those kids really are grieving, they don't have a father anymore. And so what can we do?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, having that takeaway of,
Yeah.
how can I use this information individually? And I'll say, from an organizational standpoint, Rebecca, you didn't ask the question yet, but I thought I
No,
should.
go for it.
I was going there.
Go for it. She was coming.
But, ADAC has done a lot. We have, different presentations. There's
Hmm.
some diversity within presentations, some keynote speakers having this conversation. Um, Scholarships committees,
Hmm.
diversity and inclusion committee. But I did think about, what are some of the opportunities where we can continue to advance, and some of the thoughts that I had, being intentional when we do have face-to-face conferences again, someday in the future, being really intentional about businesses and vendors that we're supporting and trying to be strategic about supporting minority owned businesses and vendors. Um, Service learning opportunities, that's something that has been casually discussed. But in other organizations, there's really an initiative to, in the host city that you're in, that you're doing some kind of a service project
Hmm.
to reduce inequity. And that lends itself well to partnering then with organizations that are focused on eradicating racism. So I think those are just a couple of specific organizational macro level opportunities for growth to reduce these blind spots.
And ADEC has in the past done community. I've been on some of those panels, and ADEC was, I don't know, at some point, culture shift, and sometimes it's just logistical things. But yeah, I'm glad that you brought that back to the forefront of doing something in communities. And I think that's something a lot of organizations want to work on, right? Because I've been part of a lot of groups, and all of these brilliant scholars in this one billion building, and then it just gets lost because so much else goes into planning.
Yeah.
But it's like, do y'all know the impact we could have had besides a
Uh-huh.
donation? Because some groups will just donate money. It's like, no, but they need to see us. Like, we literally could go do three different things. Like, we could just separate, and like, there's so much, so the need is so high.
Yeah.
An
Hmm.
hour somewhere, I know we're in the midst of COVID, but that's a really those are great ideas. I want to mention a takeaway also for people who are working within the organization. When you're doing writing or research, or try to note any efforts you've made toward addressing diversity, right? So try to note that, right? So for example, when we study populations and it's majority white, people don't explain why they did that, right? When we do populations are majority black, there's all this explanation about why we chose this group because they're dealing with this, and we don't see that paralleled in studies where the majority of populations are white. We don't say, well, we chose white because of this, and we chose white because of it, right? So being aware of that, and if you are doing something to, you know, I also challenge people when this whole notion of hard to reach, figure it out. You got this, right? You can get out into those communities that you reach as possible. Just consulting, reading, and figuring out how you might do that, and noting it in your actual research as models for other people about the strategies that you've been using, whether they were successful or not, right? But trying. So
And I would, on an individual level for ADAC, encourage to be welcoming, right?
yeah,
It's it's hard to feel safe when you don't see a lot of people who look like you or who don't have the same identity. And some identities we get to adopt, right? Like when you asked me and I say researcher, because that's where my focus is, right? That's where I put a
yeah,
lot of my emphasis, which is a
yeah,
luxury, right?
yeah, yeah,
I can't hide or downplay my identity as a white person. I can upsell or downsell being a Czech.
yeah,
I'm Slavic and Irish, can you tell? Right? I can't
yeah,
hide that, right? So if I'm in an environment where I feel very different, I'm not going to feel safe and welcomed unless people make that overture. And so
yeah,
similarly, one of the things I think we can do to help encourage a lot more people to be a part of ADAC is for those of us that are in ADAC to be extra welcoming and reassuring and become that secure base for someone coming into the organization who may be different or feel different than what they perceive the membership to be.
Yeah, it makes a world of a difference. And you
mm-hmm.
mentioned, having representation across people, across presentations, across speakers, being able to see yourself in the organization.
Yeah. And I do think there's high attendance in presentations related to code. That's another strength, right? So we're talking about what we can do, and I also want to say I want to commend people for showing up. I don't think I've done a presentation at ADEC where people were not hungry for the information or there because they live it and they just are they needed that validation. It was healing, right? So it's like, so showing up for those. And I can tell you personally, Dr. Ron Barrett, Ron Barrett, who is no longer physically with us, uh, he was a longtime mentor of mine and a lot of people really. And I can tell you that his welcoming me into that organization really was what kept me there. It had me. He basically gave me a role to play when I came back. He was like, "So I'm going to put you down for X." So it's like, oh wow, I'm like committed, and all of the people who like were there. I mean, putting their arms around. Well, with COVID again, but it absolutely mattered, and it mattered both by people of color as well as allies, and so having a job and a responsibility is a part of belongingness. So how do we bring people in and make that validate, wow, you have this skill, okay, well next time you come back and you're like I was chair of that organization before I knew it. So like, yeah, so people of color as well as allies, like saying you matter, I see you, that's very small but it's huge. And look, I've been here all these years, got Jennifer in there now, and so yeah, it matters.
It does matter.
Yeah.
Michelle, I think your your capture of social justice is being I see you and I hear you is probably one of the most profound synthesizations, there we go, that I have heard of that. And that really is what it's about. I see you, I hear you. And then that advocacy piece is
Mm-hmm.
I will stand in the gap with you.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
again,
will,
we're seeing that. We're seeing it at the protests, or like not just there, but we're seeing it with people writing letters or just
Oh yeah.
deciding this is not okay. And I think we're seeing that is so important for coping among, black populations, like just being able to see. I actually felt like, you know what, I usually am at some of these protests for various things, or whatever, just to be increase visibility of loss and grief and people's experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But I honestly felt like, okay, I can actually spend my energy contributing to this by doing talks or presentations, right? And I've been doing a bunch of those, right? Just as Jennifer, because I haven't, but it spared me from having to feel like I have to also be out there doing that, because that's exhausting, right? So I'm like, okay, there are people, I can step outside of this ring a little bit because the work is going to get done, and we need that, right? Like, so,
And
so,
everyone's contribution, regard,
yes,
is
yes,
important. So
yes,
people on the front line, people that are writing, people that are
yes,
speaking up, people that are just, I noticed you mentioned not using the word challenge, so I'm trying to think of a different word to show. But people, when you're having a conversation and you just say, well, I disagree, I would maybe
yeah,
reword it this way.
mm-hmm,
That's all important.
yes,
it's about dialogue,
mm-hmm,
right? It's really about that dialogue and that hearing. And um, I heard a great speaker a few weeks ago who was talking, he was comparing what's going on right now politically to the story about the Tower of Babel.
mm,
And so, with that story being, you have different languages that are suddenly put upon people, and so they can't understand each other, and that now it's a difference in language of culture and not understanding the language of where that person is coming from, and so we're
mm-hmm,
not hearing each other. And
mm-hmm,
it means that you're more likely to misunderstand. And in feeling misunderstood, we have two options: either try to clarify miscommunication
Mhm.
or to continue to be frustrated or hurting.
mm-hmm,
And so I think one of the things that we're going to get out of this conversation is to get more into some of the logistics of the loss, the bereavement overload, the cumulative loss, looking more at those thanatological pieces. It's also recognizing that we're minimizing some of that misunderstanding. We're giving voice to what hasn't been heard
mm-hmm.
and empowering people to work better with the ones that are in their lives and in their life.
And it contributes to positive health outcomes. I mean,
Yeah.
we all benefit. Cost, I study violence, and when the average teen or a person who is shot goes to the hospital, it costs thousands of dollars to commute. So I mean, there are so many benefits to working together and trying to sort through things, and just being present. The earth has plenty. Right, we can do that. We can do it, and we have even more
Yeah.
when we are listening and being present. Because otherwise, it's going to cost. It's going to cost financially. It's going to cost through deaths. It's more costly to not. So I want to thank you again. It's such a pleasure to be connected again. Have to share this time with Dr. Matthews as well as you, Dr. Morris. Um,
Oh,
and thank you for creating this space.
Right. Yeah.
thank you both. I mean, for taking the time, for taking the energy, right? Because that's
Hmm.
something that can't be, it, I can't do enough to show my appreciation because you're both wearing so many hats and you are putting so much of yourselves into the work you're doing, into helping to educate. And I just appreciate so much you're sharing that gift of yourselves, not just your professional expertise, but yourselves and who you are.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I am going to stop the recording now because we could go on forever.
Yeah.
We have so much that we're going to be bringing forward in the other conversations. This is really just getting our feet wet into starting a conversation and to continue it. So, for our viewers, thank you so much.
Yes, thank
And
you.
we will
Thank you.
see you again.